Alright, now it's time to look at some classic comics in the Smithsonian Book of Newspaper Comics. Today we'll be looking at a Buster Brown and the Katzenjammers kids. But first, let's look in the Encyclopedia of Comics. We're just going on the next page. Here we have some black and white examples. Here we have, this is done by Winsor McKay, who is famous for Little Nemo. Here we have Little Sammy Sneeze, and the caption reads, he just simply couldn't stop it. He never knew when it was coming. So it's about a boy who sneezes, which seems like a vaudeville act, I'm sure. So here's a boy in the middle of the road. He's about to sneeze. It looks like he's about to get run over by a horse and carriage. It's very difficult to read the writing, but the impression I get is that the horse has gone out of control, and there's a woman in the carriage, and they're about to crash, and the boy's sneeze is so terrible that it stops the horse. And so you have a man who actually rewards the boy with money for stopping the horse, which is interesting. Here we have a Buster Brown. Now I thought Buster Brown was a Sunday comic only, but perhaps at one point it also had a daily supplement. I really don't know. But here we have what we would now call a crossover with Buster Brown and Ocott's original creation, the Yellow Kid. The Yellow Kid is meant to be an Irish immigrant. His speech is sort of a patois of Irish and German immigrant slang. Not slang, but, well, patois, I suppose. Now, Bringing Up Father by George McManus. This is an example from 1919. Bringing Up Father is about an Irish immigrant couple who make it rich, and Maggie is always trying to improve her husband, and her husband just likes going to the pub and eating corned beef and cabbage. This comic strip actually has a bit of a connection with my family. When I was growing up, the Irish side of my family always had oyster stew at Christmas and corned beef and cabbage, and I always found that strange because I was never really sure where that came from. And then when I was reading, I read that this comic strip was so popular at the time that this character's eating habits influenced Irish immigrants of that generation, who would have been my great-grandparents. And so my great-grandparents essentially got their custom from this comic strip, and then this passed down to my grandparents. As we will see with comics, much of their language has entered English, especially American English. Words like palooka and jeep, and there's a lot of slang terms that we don't even think about anymore. Alright, so here is a panel. Mutt and Jeff toast some of the famous comic characters of the period 1913. Some of these we have met, so we have Little Nemo and his goblin friend, whose name escapes me at the moment. Mutt and Jeff, obviously. There we have the father from Bringing Up Father. Some of these characters I've seen before, but I don't remember their names. Is this Bringing Up Baby, perhaps? And this was like a kind of a melodrama. That was the bad guy. But anyway, this is, once again, what we might call a crossover event. Maybe a very special Christmas. Alright, so let's turn. Tomorrow we will look at this Terry and Pirates page. But today the main focus is to look at these Sunday pages. Now, I looked online, and I found out that some of these Sunday pages for Buster Brown were reprinted in early comic book form, and what they did is they divided the page this way. So one page would have this, and then the next page would have that. Since these were originally printed as oversized newspaper pages, when it was printed in book form, it had to be cropped, so that's how they did it. Now, with Buster Brown, you'll see there's a similar format with Little Nemo, where we have a title, which is unique for every episode, every Sunday episode. Then we have a story, and the story always ends the same way. With Little Nemo, we have waking up in bed, and then with Buster Brown, we have a resolution or a moral of sorts. Now, what's interesting about these early panels is that we have a combination of things. We have a combination of in which the artist has to teach people how to read comics since they're still brand new. But there are a lot of things taken for granted that he doesn't have to explain. Something that's really interesting about comics is that children don't have to be taught how to read them. When children pick up Charlie Brown and Snoopy or a Spider-Man comic or the like, they sort of puzzle it out themselves how to read it, and they do fine. And I mean, there's some things that are just taken for granted. But there are other things the early artists really had to figure out. So you'll notice that we still have numbers to tell us how to read things. And, we have the balloons point to people to tell us how to read, which we will not always see with all comics. Some comics will have captions, some of them will do other things with balloons. I suppose this is analogous to silent films of the day. Silent films had to create all of the convention of film. Well, all the conventions without sound, I suppose, aside from organ music. And when we look at these silent films, people debate which silent film invented different panning shots and how to dissolve and all of these things. Probably the truth of the matter is a lot of these things were developed independently, some of these things were developed by accident, and some of them were invented by a specific film. And it spread from there as a combination of all of these things. And I imagine this is the same with comics. We're never really going to be sure who figured out how panels work and who figured out how to do motion and things in a panel, who figured out how to do time. So, for instance, this panel tells us time is passing because we see the same place and the maids come forward, and with the same angle, this tells us the movement of time. This tells us that maybe a minute has passed, and this is the movement that happens. Whereas in between these panels, since the background is very different, we know that more time has passed. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes has passed. Did the artists have to think down and figure that out? No, I think it was very intuitive. I think they just had a grasp of how to express movement and time on the comic strip page. One thing that's also interesting about this is think of where the camera is. This reminds me a little bit of the Tintin page. I think Tintin begins in the 1920s, maybe 1930s, I'm not really certain. But Tintin often has the camera sort of away from the action, and it keeps everything static, which is good for certain types of stories. And I noticed that we have a similar camera of sorts working with these comics. So maybe later on we will see other artists experimenting with where to put the camera, when to have close-ups, when to do interesting things with the panels. Then once again we see threes and fours, which are things that we like in art. We certainly love that. Once again, I'm not even sure anyone had to think about that. That was probably intuitive, although I could be wrong. Anyway, the plot is Buster Brown gets some pumpkins. Now I notice here in the title we have the word pumpkin, in the dialogue we have punkin, or punk-in. And I'm wondering, is that meant to be some type of a dialect of the time? Perhaps German, perhaps Irish? You will notice in these early comics there is a lot of German and a lot of Irish dialogue, or dialect, or perhaps pseudo-dialect. And it's kind of indicative of the time that there was so much of an Irish and so much of a German influence on American popular culture. Until World War I, of course, we will still have a lot of German influence on our comics. After World War One, and to the present day, German culture is considered suspect in American culture. German and Russian cultures to this day, which is often it's just a little provincial, I suppose. Anyway, Buster Brown and his friend get a lot of pumpkins. They're going to carve these pumpkins to play a prank. This character, this may be Mary Jane, I'm guessing. That's got to be a girl because she has a bow in the hair. I know it's sometimes difficult to tell the difference between boys and girls in Buster Brown. It's because they are upper class folk and the boys have curled hair. But I'm sure that's got to be Mary Jane. So, Tige and Buster Brown pull off this prank, and the maids run upstairs, and they see all of these jack-o'-lanterns, I guess with candles inside them, and the jack-o'-lanterns get tossed down, and it's a big mess. So it's sort of a slapstick type thing. And then we have this very long and complicated moral, in which he says, jokes are fun, humor is good. Katzenjammer Kids is similar in the sense that every week we kind of have the same story, where in this case the Bart Simpson like Katzenjammer twins play a prank on someone, and then he gets spanked by the captain at the end because they're so wicked. I actually cannot tell the difference between Hans and Fritz, aside from one is blonde and one is has dark hair. I guess they're like Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Although I'm sure Carl Barks could tell them apart. And maybe the new version of the show. But anyway, in this version, the boys are doing a Punch and Judy puppet show, which we don't really see anymore. And they vow revenge against the peg-legged captain or cook. I do like this panel. So the captain had them stop playing the puppet show, and the boys revenge. Revenge, yes sirree, revenge you bet. And look how serious they are. They are really after revenge for having their playtime stopped. I can respect the kids for that. And so, of course, they pull a prank by yanking in the peg leg, smacking the guy in the head with a puppet mallet, and then the captain spanks them, and the captain has an accordion leg, which is actually kind of funny to have an accordion leg. They can do a lot with that. I mean, you know, the captain's giving orders, and there's a music playing whenever he waddles around. So anyway, early comics. Tomorrow we will look at more Katzenjammer Kids and this comic, Maud, and we will look at more of how the panels has progressed. And I'll talk to you later. Goodbye.